Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday build. This is episode 1.4. Today, we're going to be discussing the topic where colors taste like lemon drops, synesthesia, simile, and analogy in no-code, low-code development. Today, we'll be featuring Leonardo da Vinci, cake, colors, music, language, document, and more. My name is Brittany Hernandez. You've met me before, or if you're new, my friend Emily calls me B, so feel free to call me the B emoji or peanut brittle, which is a mix of what my uncle calls me as a nickname and what my dad calls me as a nickname. I'm from San Diego, but I live in London. I have lots of different experience. I served on active duty in the United States military for 4 years, earned the GI Bill to pay for law school. I became a lawyer. Focused on intellectual property and entertainment law in California, moved to London for a master's degree in international film business, which I completed, and then afterwards became the business development executive for Vala, which is a legal tech startup out of Scotland. I then became a professional builder, or what was called at the time a documenter, which is basically someone who focuses on the document platform, but also a blend of no-code, low-code techniques in order to create different apps and workflows. In my case, it was specifically for law firms and lawyers. I also serve as a global ambassador to law schools for Documate, which has rebranded recently as Gavel. I'm also their program director and senior instructor for the Law Students in Legal Tech Access to Justice Fellowship Program. And I'm the creator and host of the Lightning Talks for Legal Innovator series in partnership with Gavel. And that actually happens tomorrow, Thursday, the 26th. We're going to have Haley from Gig Law actually talk to us about her automation processes and how they're important for different businesses and so on. So you're welcome to come. It's free every month on the last Thursday. I also am the creator and host of this series called Wednesday Build. And I created the first free interactive digital magazine, Code Word Hex, on Documate. And I'm the founder, course creator, and senior instructor for Command Academy, where we have Documenter certification courses, courses on software and Airtable, and more. Enough about me. Let's get into today's really cool topic. I'm really excited for this one. I spent a lot of time thinking about how I might want to talk about the ideas that are in my head around this topic of where colors taste like lemon drops and synesthesia, simile, and analogy, and how it's applied to no-code, low-code development, or just sort of any creative endeavor. So as an overview, we're going to go over 3 things: defining things, so the definition of a couple of these terms so that we can kind of all be on the same page about what we're talking about. I'm going to go into my very elaborate theory about cake, how it applies here, and we'll go into some different examples and my cake theory applied. So let's get straight into it. So first, let's start with some definitions. So as I said, we're talking about synesthesia, simile, and analogy, and how we apply that to no-code, low-code development. So let's first understand what synesthesia is. So synesthesia is a diagnosis, this is WebMD, that makes it to where when you hear music, for example, you see shapes, or you can taste colors, or you can see emotion. It's just kind of where your senses get crossed. So for example, it says one of the most common responses is to see letters, numbers, or sounds as colors. So we're not really supposed to see those that way, but you might also see or hear a word and taste food. So, let's say you see a picture, or somebody says burger and you can actually taste a burger, or maybe something else got crossed and somebody says burger but you actually taste salad, or you see a shape and you taste food. And so anyway, so the point of synesthesia is to say that 2 things that are disparate and 2 senses that aren't meant to cross over with each other actually do in the case of synesthesia, which is really interesting. I've had 1 or 2 instances of this in my own personal life where I was experiencing something and saw a color when it wasn't really supposed to be there. So it's very interesting when it happens. It's a little bit euphoric, you could say, and a bit trippy at the same time. But we're going to be talking about this idea of having things that aren't seemingly meant to cross towards each other that actually do. So we'll go into an example of that later as far as building in no-code, low-code development. Simile, similarly, is a figure of speech in this case, often used in poetry and novels that has to do with involving the comparison of one thing with another thing of a different kind, used to make a description more emphatic or vivid, as brave as a lion, so on and so on. But this idea of comparing two different things in order to make a connection is really the important part here. Analogy as well is a comparison between one thing or another, typically for one purpose of explanation or clarity. So analogy between the workings of nature and those of human societies. So that will be coming into play as well. With that being said, let me pull up my Canva once more. Now that we're kind of talking about the same things and everyone's on the same page as far as what is synesthesia, what is simile, what is analogy, and obviously we're all adults here, so we know what most of these words mean, but just to get our brains and our minds into this context of things that are seemingly not similar, but actually when you have some kind of connection or cross, they have something in common that propels something very interesting. So we're going to go into that. But first, so now that we've done our definitions, let's talk about my theory about cake. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time in this section, and then we're going to go over examples of what I'm talking about, because it's going to sound very weird at first. So in Forrest Gump says that life, he uses simile to say that life is like a box of chocolates. And I would argue that life isn't like a box of chocolates. It's actually more like a 7-layered triangle cake turned on its side with a cherry on top, which looks a little bit like this. And the reason why I say that is the following. So if we pull this section right here out and just visualize this as this sort of cake with multiple layers on its side with a cherry on top, let's say it would look something like this. And this is something that I think about a lot for some reason. My brain just loves to think about this idea of what's really happening in the world, especially when it comes to creativity and the differences between me and someone else. What makes my brain different or more unique, or not more unique, but different from someone else's brain. I was only recently introduced to the idea of neurodiversity, and I have a nephew that's autistic and I have a friend that's autistic, but it seems to me that neurodiversity has a much wider spectrum than just labeling or diagnosing someone as one thing or another, ADHD or neurodiverse or autistic or whatever. I'm not a doctor or anything to be able to say what someone is or is not, or what I am or whatever. But the point is that our brains are going to be different depending on our life experiences, what traumas we've experienced, our physiology, our ability to connect different things together. All of these things are different between person to person. So I think that's very interesting because we all live in the same world, but we have so many diverse experiences. And I'm very interested in how that relates to what people contribute to the world, or how they express themselves and how they do that in a unique way that nobody else can. So let's talk a little bit about that and break this down a little bit more. So what we're talking about is a framework for understanding how people might interact with the world in a way that they can not manipulate, but harness and utilize in order to come up with more creative ideas and to make more solid connections between seemingly disparate things, as you would do with your senses with something like synesthesia, as you would do intentionally with something like simile, and as we do an analogy when we're comparing two things together and finding some common outcome. So in this mindset, I think that there's several steps And I've broken them down into 7 with a cherry on top. So in my view, we have at our foundation, the first layer of life and the universe and everything is this idea of universal truths and mysteries that are in constant motion. So we live in a world where there are forces acting upon us, some that are known, some that are unknown. We only use, I can't remember what the statistic is, like 3% or something of our brains, but we can use our brains in a way that makes it to where we notice and observe the stimulus around us in a more creative and useful way. So let's say we have, like I said, we have the universal truths and mysteries of the universe in constant motion around us. So there's gravity, there's different forces, and so on and so on. So what's happening then is that when we look at our own lives and how we respond to things, there's something that happens. There's a force that acts upon us, or so this can be, so like the universal truths and motion, mysteries and constant motion, are always in operation, whether we believe in them, see them, or perceive them or not. And this idea, well, obviously it's not very like hard to say, obviously like that's happening, but in my own understanding, the way that I kind of think about this comes from Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Four Agreements and the Fifth Agreement. So the 5 agreements are: be impeccable with your word, don't take anything personally, don't make assumptions, always do your best, and be skeptical but learn to listen. And in his book, it talks about Toltec wisdom and how you should just strip everything down. And we talked about that when it comes to things like your pliable small identity. So he focuses on this idea of being impeccable with your word. And the idea of agreements generally is that we kind of as humans have agreed to certain rules in society, that we've agreed to the names of certain things with language. And I think he gives in the book an example of this idea of like a tree. So he says, for example, so a tree is living in the forest, in the forest or whatever, and it has been there for 200 years or however many thousand years or whatever. And a person then comes upon that tree that was living in the forest before man was even there, especially the person who has come upon it. But the human has said, I'm going to call this a tree. And that is just sort of like an arbitrary choice from a human that has said, this thing that has existed before me and that will live on after me is going to be called this thing. And the idea there is, if we strip away the label of what we gave it, we can see that this thing has existed and was going to exist, whether we acknowledged its presence there or not, and whether we gave it a label or not. So there are many things in the universe that you could say, and in the world that we're interacting with all of the time, that we give labels to, but they're not arbitrary in the sense that now we've all agreed of what things mean, but they're arbitrary from the beginning of, we just said, this shall be called a tree, and this shall be called a table or whatever. So the point is there that we have to be really mindful of language and how we label things. And that goes back to that idea of premature cognitive commitment that we talked about in episode 1.1, because when you say this is blank, then you are automatically shutting yourself off to the idea that this thing could be anything else, and it limits your ability to make connections, which we'll go into later. So that's just to say there are constantly universal truths and mysteries in constant motion, operating at all times, whether or not we believe in them, perceive them, or acknowledge them, and whether we label them correctly or not. And then if we go on into the next part, so we're building this idea up, and then I'll give examples of how they all connect to what we're talking about as far as creativity in design of new applications, new websites, new just anything. So we'll go into kind of what the expression looks like later. So as I said, so these things are happening in the world around us that we either perceive, acknowledge, believe in, or whatever, or not. But then something happens. So when we talk about a stimulus or stimuli, something walks across in front of us. Someone says something to us. We feel something. We, we get hit by a car. We serve in the military and see someone in the water, and it triggers something in us. So there's something that happens. There's some kind of stimulus that happens in our lives that invites us to act, for example. That could even be a thought comes in your head. It could be that your partner says, I love you. It could be that you read a book, a passage in a book, you heard something in a conversation, whatever. The point is that there's some kind of stimulus that happens. So this can be, like I said, internal or external, and volitional or organic. So in a future episode, we'll talk about volitional stimuli. So that's the idea that you are stimulating and triggering this process on purpose with an intention to do so. So that would be something that's volitional. So you've done that act on purpose or intentionally. And then organic would be it just happens. So that can also be internal volitional, external volitional, internal organic, or external organic. So obviously organic things being that they've come up naturally and nobody was forcing something to happen. It wasn't a voluntary act to do so. So the point is something happens either on purpose, stimulated by us, or initiated by us, or not, or by someone else. Then what happens is we personally, since we're focusing on this happening to us, perceive that, but the perception of it is filtered through what I'm going to call PMES, which is our physical, mental, and emotional and spiritual state. So when we talk about this, what I'm talking about is physically, we could experience the stimuli or the stimulus, whichever is the case, but not be in a physical state to observe anything about it, to actually perceive it. So for example, let's say we had a disability. So let's say that I had so it's filtered through our perception. So we can still perceive parts of it, but let's say, but not all of it, or vice versa. So for example, let's say that I'm at a concert, but I have a hearing impairment. So I can perceive through my physical state that there is a singer on stage, and I can perceive through my senses that there is a vibration or a frequency that is pulsing towards my body and projecting towards me, but I can't necessarily perceive like the words or specific notes or be able to differentiate between pitch or tone or whatever else. So through my own perception and my physical state, I'm only getting a certain piece of that. So that stimulus and all that it had to offer is being filtered through my physical state. Mentally, let's say we just got in a fight with someone, let's say our partner or our child or our parent or someone on the street, we got in some type of heated argument, then the stimulus that is trying to invite us to be inspired by it, we're actually like walking right past it because we're not in the mental state to perceive it as we could if we had not just been in a fight, for example. Emotional state as well. I think this emotional state as well as the physical state can be linked. If you think about the fight or flight response and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if we talk about the hierarchy of needs, let's look at that one. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs talks about this idea that there are different levels. So I was hoping we could find a picture. So let's see. Yeah, let's look at the images. So we have so we have these different hierarchy of needs. So when we talk about your perception and your physical, mental, and emotional, as well as spiritual perception, we can talk a little bit about this hierarchy of needs. And the reason for that is because if you don't feel safe, or you don't have your physiological needs met, you can't see often the invitations to explore what the stimulus offers, for example. So here it says physiological needs include air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, and reproduction. So if we don't have these basic needs met, we can't then go higher to self-actualization, which would be the desire to become the most that one can be or reach your full potential. Safety needs, personal security, employment, resources, health, and property. If you have, for example, a time in your life where you're really, really struggling financially and you're focused solely on putting food on the table, making sure you have a roof over your head, that you have a job so that you can pay your bills and have electricity, having the ability to access doctors and deal with any health problems, to be able to have a bed to sleep in, and so on, then you're not in an emotional or a physical or mental state to then, like I said, perceive and pursue what the stimulus that's come across your either internal or external state to act upon that. So if we think about that, then we can see that there's all these forces that are around us in the world. Something is a stimulus that comes within our awareness, which would be external or internal, organic or volitional. Then that stimulus is filtered through our physical, mental, emotional, and then spiritual state. So if we don't believe in certain things, so it's kind of like that idea of the exercise where it's like this exercise where you basically say, the person who's leading the session, as let's say I'll do now, would say something like, look around the room, take a moment to look around the room and tell me everything, count the number of things that you can see that are red. And so you look around the room, and I can see in my perception right now, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, let's say 9 things. So I can see 9 things that are red. And then the person says, okay, now tell me without looking, when you were looking around, how many things did you see that were green? So this idea being that it's sort of like the idea that energy goes where attention flows, or however the phrase specifically is. But the idea here is that if you are specifically looking for something, then you're gonna not see, and it will glaze by your eyes, whatever else is in the room, because you've given your mind this command that we're only looking for something that fits this particular description. So in the case of spirituality, you could say, and I'm not here to try to say what anyone's religion should be or how they should interact with spirituality. What I'm trying to say here is that when you look at the world and perceive the world and the universal truths and mysteries that are in operation, when you filter that through your perception and the many layers of perception that you've granted to spirituality and, let's say, religion or lack of religion, then you won't see the things in the world that counter that, or you will dismiss or ignore them if you've not chosen to be open to the idea that anything else could be possible. So when we go through this process, and it will make more sense when I go through an example, but for now, let's just talk about the model overall. So we have this idea that there are universal truths and mysteries in constant motion that are in operation at all times, whether we believe them, perceive them, acknowledge them or not. Then we have a stimulus or multiple stimuli that come into our realm of our internal or external state. which are volitional or organic. Then we filter what we perceive about that stimulus, which is an invitation for us to observe and interact with and pay attention to the stimulus or not. You don't want to pay attention to every single stimulus, or you would have your whole life just like looking at one thing for a long time and then looking at nothing for a long time, which I get stuck into sometimes. But the idea being that your brain is constantly filtering things out based on your personal physical, mental, emotional, spiritual perception, but also what you've commanded your mind to pay attention to. So with that being said, we're constantly like narrowing the number of things that we can do with the stimulus that has invited us to pay attention to it. So let's say we are done talking about this personal, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual perception state and what you can do. So let's say you do perceive something like let's say, for example, you have the example of the person who's at the concert and someone is standing on the stage. So what would happen next is this stage of observation. So we talked previously about this idea in meditation about the gap. So the gap is the distance, a space that we create and can live in and manipulate in a way, and spend time in, even Einstein time in, which I can go into later, between the stimulus and our response. So this section here is called the gap. So let me just put a little circle here to kind of reiterate this point. So this is between the stimulus and the response. So if we take this gap and this idea of the gap and we think about it, what we are saying is there is an opportunity between the moment that we are stimulated in some way or experience a stimulus and the time that we respond to it. So I'm just going to put a quick arrow here to say gap. And let's do that now. This is Canva, by the way, if you want to know what I'm using for the presentation. So this circle is called the gap. And like I said, what we're talking about here is this idea in meditation that there's space between when you experience a stimulus and when you respond to it. And I'm going to just quickly go into this idea of Einstein time. Everyone knows who Einstein is. But what he says is that time is relative. In other words, the rate at which time passes depends on your frame of reference. So that is this idea that time can slow down or quicken depending on your relative frame of reference. So we can spend what we could perceive relatively as all day in this space. And I generally like to, just because that's where a lot of my creativity comes, is spending time between thinking about something or having something happen, like a feeling or a conversation or taking a course that stimulates something in my brain. And then just breaking it down like so much to the point where I'm making slides like this about a 7-layer cake with a cherry on top. Before I do something. And so this idea is really important because this gap makes it to where you're able to spend time looking at, not just perceiving something, but observing it. And that kind of goes back to the building blocks we talked about in the first episode, which is around noticing and noting. And that kind of goes to this point of observation or observing something fully. And this idea of noticing and observation, it requires full presence. So there's Eckhart Tolle has a book called The Power of Now, which is very, very good. So I highly recommend this book, Power of Now. It's a guide to spiritual enlightenment, but he kind of just talks about the importance of presence and how that can really impact your life. So let me just get some of these out of here. So if you're going to be observing something about something that you perceive from the stimulus that has invited you to pay attention to it, let's use the example, like I said, of there's a person who is has a hearing impairment, who goes to a concert and can filter through their perception that there is a singer and a band on stage that's projecting a vibration and a frequency that then comes towards this person and provides a sensation of some kind. So that could be your stimulus. So the concert itself, the waves of sounds that are washing over this person, it's filtered through their physical ability to perceive what's being projected and all the different elements of that force. Then we go into this idea of observation. So the person can pause in this gap and notice something about what's happening. That could be something around the way that it feels. They can observe that there's maybe like a tingle on their skin when the vibration comes towards them. They can observe that they feel a sense of elation or happiness or joy to be in a crowd with people who are sharing the same experience. They can observe the sweat drop that's dripping off of the singer's face and observe that it's very hot that day. They can observe that or notice that the drummer keeps looking over to the side of the stage right because maybe there's something going on in the background. They can observe that there's many security guards around that have suddenly moved. They can observe many, many different things about this situation. But let's go with the idea that this person is observing through their ability to perceive based on their physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual state. They've observed that when the music comes towards them, they feel a vibration and a sensation in their body that feels like tingly. Now, what can happen next is this really important part that takes us into the next part of this section here, where we move out of this black, where all of the magic happens. And that is here in this area of synesthesia, simile, and analogy that we're talking about. Connection plus creativity. So within this gap space where you're living in Einstein time and everything is slowing down and you're observing the world and you're observing your sensations, you're observing your senses, you're observing the world around you. When you make a connection and you get curious about that thing, that's when you can have something happen that's really interesting in your life. And you can create something that's very original because there are certain things that only you can connect because nobody else has ever lived your life before and nobody else has ever lived your private moments, which we've talked about before. So with that being said, maybe there's something that only you can connect two things together. So for example, let's say that you as the person at the concert have observed this vibration. And it turns out that you're actually also studying engineering. Or let's say you're studying like specifically let's say you're studying like bridge building or something. And let's say that you are at the concert taking a day off. So your mind isn't really thinking about that. But when you feel the wave of vibrations, and that tingling sensation on your skin. It reminds you of something that you learned, and you connect some some neurons are firing in your brain and making some connections from something that you learned in your class. So even though you're experiencing a physical sensation of vibration towards you and in your body and on your skin, you're having a sort of synesthetic moment where this is connecting to something completely unrelated to what you're experiencing in the concert. But the stimulus of being in the concert and your perception, because you specifically have a hearing impairment, you're not listening to the sound, or you're not listening to the words as much as you're listening and feeling the vibration, which means that you're able to make this connection because of your studies, that you think about how earthquakes happen, and when they happen, let's say at a desert where there's a bridge, and I'm studying bridges, for example, how things like rumble, or how you could say like how pebbles jump on the ground. So maybe that makes it to where you wonder how you might make you get curious. You say, I wonder if I might be able to design a type of cement or a type of bonding agent or material that would allow for these jumps, because it has a similar sensation to the way that on your body and on your skin at the concert, the music is bouncing and dancing on your skin and causing your skin to raise, let's say with goosebumps, for example. Anyway, but this point is that you're creating some connection and having some curiosity about what might happen if you made these two connections together. So you have this opportunity to live in this gap. Now, let's say that you have that experience. You are the person at the concert that felt the vibration and had the connection about the bridge and our earthquakes and new bonding agents and everything. There's an opportunity here, which we'll make another circle here. This is opportunity here. So there's an opportunity to respond to your thought. I'm just going to lock this for a second. So I'm just going to say that this part here represents opportunity. So what we're talking about here comes a little bit from, there's a couple of different references for this here, one of which is the genius moment. So some of these ideas are coming from in my head from me reading a book. So in Gay Hendricks' book, The Big Leap, in The Big Leap, he talks about something called the genius zone, which we've talked about in, I think it was episode 1.2. And in his other book called The Genius Zone, which goes into that in more depth, he talks about something called the genius moment and the genius move. So he says the meta tool. The first part of the book, you'll learn how to spot what I call the genius moment and how to use a specific tool called the genius move. The genius moment is an opening, an invitation to bring forth your highest potential. You get hundreds of genius moments every day, each one an opportunity to make the genius move and step through into the life you really want to live. The genius move is a mind-body tool you can apply in the blink of an eye. Each time you use it, you create more open space through which your genius can be accessed and expressed. Think of your genius move as a meta tool, one that makes all your other tools work better. Now, the thing I like about this particular passage and this idea of the genius moment is that it's an invitation to bring forth your highest potential. So it's kind of like I was saying about the stimulus itself is an invitation for you to pay attention to something. Whether it's something that should be paid attention to or not is filtered by your physical, mental, and emotional state, but some things that should have gone through maybe didn't get through or were blocked because of your particular mental state at the time, and so on. The point is that it's an invitation. So you get a second invitation here, a different type, an invitation here to respond, and an opportunity. Let's say you saw invitation and opportunity. Yeah. So you have an invitation and an opportunity to respond to this whole process that you've just gone through. And what I wanted to say about this is also about the 5-second rule. So the 5-second rule comes from Mel Robbins, who has this great book called The 5-Second Rule. And she says, the 5-second rule, and let me just find Mel Robbins specifically. We can find a summary or something. But basically, she says the 5-second rule is simple. If you have an instinct to act on a goal, you must physically move within 5 seconds or your brain will kill it. So if we go back to our example, that's exactly what I wanted to say. So basically what she says is in like neurology or physiology or whatever, the point is that when a moment flashes in your head that gives this connection, when you make this neural connection and you have this curiosity, there's about 5 seconds where you can physically act on what respond to that invitation to your genius move or your genius moment. Or your brain will say like, oh, I guess it's not that important, so I'm going to let it go away. So this is where a second brain really comes in handy, which in my case, I use Notion, which is just a way to jot down an idea really, really fast. So in my case, like I said, I use Notion, or I like Notion. So Notion is this tool that allows you to basically do anything you want. But let's say I'm just talking about Clio here, but let's go to quick reference. And you can see some of my ideas for things like code word hacks or the Wednesday build. So I had this idea where colors taste like lemon drops, which is the one I'm doing right now. Life is like a 4-layered cake, but I actually changed it later to 7-layer cake. Filling up your reservoir is going to be our next one, and so on. So when a flash comes into my head, I write it down in Notion and respond within 5 seconds, or put a reminder on my phone or write a note down, just so that I'm giving the respect to the invitation and responding so that it doesn't get killed by my brain based on what Mel Robbins is saying. So that is what we're talking about when we talk about a response. Then, so let's say, for example, in our case of the person who has a hearing impairment, who's at the concert, who has experienced the wave of vibration, touches their skin and gives a little bit of a tingle and raises their goosebumps a little bit, reminds them and flashes an image in their head of making the connection through their course about engineering and bridge building that has to do with when an earthquake happens and the little pebbles bounce across the ground, let's say in a minor earthquake, but that then allows this person to be curious about how that might work for a new bonding agent for things like cement that would allow for some room so that the cement doesn't crack when there's on the bridge when there is an earthquake, but rather it moves more flexibly. And it gives them this idea of, whatever else. This does exist already, by the way, but I'm not actually a bridge engineer, so I can't come up with anything perfect for this, other than to say, this might be how something like this would happen. So we're in that invitation and opportunity space of being invited to respond within 5 seconds to this stimulus that you perceived, spent some time observing, created some connections and curiosity, and now you're responding. So let's say this person pulls out a note from their back pocket, writes it down, writes the idea down, puts it back in their pocket. Now we can move on to this idea of how that is expressed. So expressions can be public or private, ephemeral, or persistent. So the idea being that this idea could be expressed, like I said, from the note on the pad, but it also could be expressed by this person actually creating the brand new bonding agent and creating a bridge out of it, which would be so cool to see that idea fully realized. And then it actually makes it to where people can get from one side of a river to another, or from one city to another or whatever. So that's a public and more persistent, or not necessarily permanent, but it lives on longer than an ephemeral moment. Or you can think of if we had, let's say instead, the person is a chef who is in culinary school, and it doesn't always have to be like a student. Let's say the professional chef who goes to the concert and has a hearing impairment and feels the tingle on their skin and the vibration, and decides that it might be interesting to have a table that vibrates when the person is eating, and that causes friction, which causes heat, so it keeps the plates warm. I don't know, whatever the case may be. Just the idea there being, though, that the experience and the expression of that idea is more ephemeral because the person will eat the food and then leave, or or whatever the case may be. Or the idea being that there is an ephemeral sort of feeling or words that are expressed, such as in an oral poetry or whatever the case may be. So you can just kind of think about how these things are expressed, but the idea being that they can be public or private, and they can be ephemeral or persistent. And then the cherry on top. So this whole process, these 7 layers in and of themselves are a beautiful experience. Just talking about that was really cool for me, to be able to come up with some cool ideas that I just came up out of nowhere. But the intellectual challenge and excitement of doing something like that is valuable in and of itself, whether you express that privately, publicly. Let's say you jot that down in your journal and nothing ever else happens. It's just a private expression of that feeling, that curiosity, that connection. Leonardo da Vinci had, I think he called it the Codex. Let's see, which Bill Gates bought for like $33 million, or can't remember. Let me just see. Leonardo da Vinci's Codex. Yeah. So he had this Codex. He actually was left-handed, so he would, well, it's assumed that he was left-handed and wrote in mirror script because then it couldn't smudge. But anyway, it's called the Codex Lister. And anyway, the point is that not every single thing that he wrote in here became a real thing, but for him, it was a beautiful experience to observe the world and to, look, so it says, Bill Gates at Christie's auction house on 11th of November 1994 in New York for US $30,802,500 bought this codex. So there you go. Anyway, so the idea here is that not every single thing that he wrote in here was actually made, but he went through this intellectual exercise and human experience of interacting with the world in a way that is really special and unique, and he made things that are just astonishing. But the idea here is that you can stop here, but the cherry on the top is monetization. So it's actually making money from what you have gone through throughout this whole process to filter down from the truths of the universe and the mysteries of it to a stimulus that happens into your life, either externally or internally, that you then filter through your physical, mental, and emotional and spiritual perception and state, which puts you into that gap and the mindset where you can observe something about what you're experiencing, make those connections and those synesthetic connections and those disparate senses and disparate sort of categories of things, and invite your curiosity to explode and to come up with all these really interesting ways of thinking about the world and what you're doing, and then responding within enough time so that your brain doesn't kill the idea by putting it within your second brain, and then expressing that fully within either in a public or private way, which can be ephemeral or persistent. And then from there, taking what you've expressed and monetizing it in some way so that you can sustain yourself to go through this cycle over and over and over again. So each of these pieces could be broken down and have a whole section on their own. But I do think it would be interesting to go through some examples of this. And one of the main things about this ability is that in this space of observation and connection and curiosity, you need to be elemental. So I'm not sure exactly the best way to say observe this, but observe the elements is kind of the point here. Let me see if I can make this a little bit clearer. So we want to say observe the essential elements. So in the example that I gave of the person who is at the concert, for example, instead of saying, the song, for example, like, so instead of saying like, oh, the song of Like a Feather from Mark Ronson and Nick Acosta is washing over me, let's say. Instead, you're breaking that down into sound and vibration and frequency and force. So it's breaking it down from what we've labeled it arbitrarily, or we've agreed to label it as something at this top layer, that surface layer, and instead breaking that down and saying, okay, actually what's really happening is they are projecting sound towards me, and then that sound is causing there to be waves in the air that hit me. And let's say I'm not describing this very scientifically, but just to say that those waves of sound are then hitting me and interacting with my physical chemistry that creates this sensation of goosebumps and raised skin, and also sort of like a vibration on my body. Anyway, the point is that you want to observe these things in an essential elemental way. And we might go over a tiny bit today, but it would be great to get through some of this stuff. So, and especially the examples. So when we observe things from an elemental level, rather than a surface level, we're able to see more of the truth of what's happening, which allows us to make more unique connections. So, so if we go through this process, for example, and we give the example of, let's do the example of Leonardo da Vinci and pull him into our conversation now. So he made this sketch of what is kind of like a military tank situation. So the idea was going to be that people were going to be able to sort of like roll this forward. And he actually got this idea from observing a turtle. So Leonardo's fighting vehicle. So if we can see maybe the story. I got this from a documentary I saw of him. So the idea was being that, here we go. So it says Leonardo's armored vehicle represented a conical cover inspired by a turtle shell. So if we look at the turtle shell, you can see that it has vertebrae and ribs, pelvic girdle, shoulder girdle, plastron, etc., etc. So the idea here being that he had this idea from observing nature. So let's say, for example, if we walk through this process as Leonardo da Vinci, there's the universal truths that are operating at all times. The stimulus would be, let's say, that he either thought of a turtle or he saw one, observed one at some point in his childhood walking by, or his real life walking by him. He perceived that, but he observed the elements of a turtle, that it had this hard shell. And then he made the connection that might be useful in the context of military battle because of this ability to protect this softer shell that is more vulnerable to attack. He responded by making a drawing and expressed it in, actually it was going to be built, but then it was actually going to be too heavy. So it would have been a public expression of this that would have been monetized, because let's say then military troops would have bought this. So that's just how this one example runs through this process in a quick way. If we go then towards the, let's say, element of colors. So let's go next to language. So if we think about language, for example, we think about the elements of language. So at the surface, there's different types of languages. And then you also have sort of dialects, and then you have alphabets, and then you have sort of like all these different things. But so I studied linguistics as a minor in college, and we were introduced to this idea of the International Phonetic Alphabet, which breaks language down into how sound, air, and how basically sounds are produced through a mouth. And if you look at this picture more closely, this is actually supposed to be representing where this sound lives inside of your mouth. And from these basic elements of sound, plosives, natals, trills, taps or flaps, fricatives, lateral fricatives, approximants, lateral approximants, clicks, voiced implosives, ejectives, you get every language from this ability to constrict, move or shape your mouth in different ways in order to produce certain types of sounds. And as I said, we might go over just a few minutes just so I can get through these different pieces and get sort of to the end point. So if you don't mind staying on, that would be perfect. If you have to go, no problem. But let's just live here for a moment into this idea. So what we're saying is, let's see how many languages there are in the world. How many languages in the world? Whoa, that is quite a lot more than I thought there were going to be. With more than 7,100 languages are spoken. That's insane. 7,151, but just 23 account for more than half of the world's population. So the point that I'm trying to make with this has to do with the fact that they all come down and break down actually into the phonetic alphabet that we just saw. So we have all these different languages, and they all are based in our ability to formulate sounds in our mouth. So if we observe this from an elemental perspective, we can see that even though we have these 7,151 languages, when we break them down all the way down to their base, they've just selected from that one page of different types of sounds that can be produced, and they've just arranged them in a unique way that causes it to be a new language. Now, if we think about this again in the terms of color theory, so let me see where we are. This is where we were with the International Phonetic Alphabet. You can talk about the same thing with elements. So we have the periodic table of elements. So if you think about this in terms of science and chemistry and the ability to mix and match these periodic table of elements, this is the same as in law as well, is only certain things can be crimes, for example, if these particular elements are met. You have the same in this idea of colors. You can break all of these different colors down into 3 primary colors: red, yellow, and blue. There's secondary colors: orange, green, and violet. Tertiary colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, red, violet, which are formed by mixing a primary with a secondary. So when you think of a painting, let's say the Mona Lisa, also by Leonardo da Vinci. So we have the Mona Lisa, which is one of the most famous paintings in the whole world. And the Mona Lisa is essentially colors that started as primary colors that were later mixed, matched, and rearranged by Leonardo da Vinci to create this particular unique image. So we have these different examples of things running through this process and being really filtered down into this process if we focus on the elements. The other example you could have here has to do with story. So it is hypothesized, and there's a book called, I think it's called The 7 Story Archetypes. And they are Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, and Rebirth. There's actually a good Wikipedia on this, so maybe The Seven Basic Plots is this book by Christopher Booker. Anyway, so he goes into those different ones: Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, Rebirth. And so if we break every story down, you can break every story ever told down into these particular ones. Examples of Rags to Riches include Cinderella, Aladdin, Jane Eyre, Little Princess, Great Expectations, David Copperfield. These are all essentially the same story. They're a story about the poor protagonist acquires power, wealth, and/or a mate, loses it all and gains it back, growing as a person as a result. Another story from Perseus, Theseus, Beowulf, Dracula, The War of the Worlds, Nicholas Nickleby, The Guns of Navarone is Overcoming the Monster. The protagonist is out to defeat an antagonistic force, often evil, that threatens the protagonist and her protagonist's homeland. Now, the idea here being that every single story and every single movie ever told can be broken down to these plots. Even further, you can say from the story brand script framework, a character with a problem meets a guide who gives them a plan and calls them to action that results in success or failure. Let me think, Donald Miller, I think is the name of this author. He goes into how you can apply this to marketing and business. And anyway, so this is just to say that plots can be broken down, stories can be broken down, colors can be broken down, elements can be broken down, language can be broken down, music even can be broken down. So if you think about all of the different types of music in the world, essentially you have notes that repeat. So you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then it repeats again, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But you have these different types of things that you can do with them, but essentially we're playing with these notes, and then you can change whether it's, treble or bass clef, or you can make it to where it's sharp or flat. But people who are like Mozart, for example, are using the same fundamental building blocks as anyone else, but in this zone of the gap where they have filtered through their own perception, life experience, physical, mental, emotional state, their particular observations about that, their connections and curiosity about what they've perceived and observed, their response to that and their expression of that and their ability to monetize it are different from other people who are less well known or who were never known because of them not seeing it exactly the same way because they didn't live the same life that that person did. Now, the point of all of this and the takeaway of all of this is to say that when we're building something, let's say with building something with Documate or with some other coding or building anything in your life. I'm just using the example of this particular tool. And the reason why is because I love it so much, and that's why I've associated myself so much with them. But even when you go to the website, it says legal document automation. So it's very much branded towards the legal industry. However, I personally have found that if I allow my mind to relax and observe what's really happening here, then I can make whatever I want with it. I can make a journal. I can make a daily habit tracker. I can make a digital interactive magazine. I can make a course, a French language learning course and tool out of it. I can make a waitlist questionnaire. I can make a personality type questionnaire or survey. It doesn't always have to be a questionnaire or a survey, but just to say, I've made escape rooms. I've made all sorts of stuff with this tool because I've allowed my mind to relax and to stay in this gap space a little bit and spend some time here to observe what we actually have to work with. So let's say when we create a new workflow, and this is the Wednesday Build episode 1.4 demo, and I say create, when I actually look at the elements of what we have available to us, instead of saying this is an instruction block being something where I write people's instructions for people, instead of saying that and saving it and running it and giving that link to somebody who then can read these instructions, I see this as a very powerful code editor. But also sort of like you could say a no code / low code / sophisticated code editor that rivals, and in some ways, well, that's subject to opinion, so careful. But it rivals, to me, in my opinion, VS Code because of its ability to rapidly launch. So I can write code in VS Code, which is amazing. And obviously I use it, and it's a tool that everyone uses in the industry and so on. But I love Documate because of the fact that you're able to, if you're able to relax your mind and not ignore, but instead of labeling this as instruction, for example, or number or decimal or whatever, the question type is, they're just giving you kind of a suggestion. Then you can actually do a lot with this. And when I say that, the reason why I say that is I was able to kind of come up with this idea of being able to mix and connect Canva images and designs with the word add-in, which is a no-code word add-in that allows you to attach logic to different things. So let's say, and then having that be inside of a workflow that people are able to answer questions and manipulate what happens on the other side of this. And the way I was able to do that is I was thinking about the fact that I wanted to be able to use one of my Canva images and designs inside of my workflow, but I wanted to be able to attach logic to and use the word add-in to attach logic to that build. And I didn't want to use a PDF because PDFs, to me, like I just prefer to use the word add-in personally. It's like a lot faster. So some people prefer the PDF diff, but either way, so there's a word add-in that allows you to quickly and easily insert variables. And I recognize that there isn't a way at first glance to download a Canva presentation as a Word document. You have these options: JPEG, PNG, PDF, PDF print, SVG, MP4, or a GIF. And there's no other option here. I mean, there's other ways to share this, but there's not other ways to download it. So you can share on social, print your design, blah, 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 all these different, like all these other different options. But in order to download it, you have to choose one of those particular things. And so if you wanted to be able to do that and attach logic and use the document tagger, then you can actually save it as an image, push it to the back of this page, and then have text lay over it. And then you can use the document tagger, the document tagger, to edit and add logic to your different builds. So that's the kind of thing that I like to play with and think about. Is obviously you always kind of start, or at least you should always start kind of like with what is it you're trying to do. And then instead of just trying to like get fancy for the sake of being fancy and complicated and trying lots of different things, and maybe there is a more efficient way, but I think that that's one way that you can do it, is that when you think about, in our context, no code, low code development, think about this process and how you might be able to spend some time in the gap of being aware of your perceptions, being aware of what you're observing, and taking time to observe the essential elements rather than the labels. So functions over labels is really important here. So instead of saying this is a legal technology tool that is for legal projects, instead say this is a powerful no-code editor that allows you to not only create things with no code, but also that to incorporate code, speak to this computer and this program and platform in multiple coding languages, including plain English, that it will then translate for me. And I can quickly launch things. And I can use these different blocks in multiple different ways. Instead of seeing this as a header, it's also in its own right a block where you can put in different codes, you can put different images, you can put whatever you want. YouTube videos, even though it looks like it's a title, you can play with it and try different things. And it's in that process that you discover things that are really unique and interesting that you can then monetize and create into a business. So I just wanted to kind of point this out and spend a little bit of time. And I appreciate you for staying on a little bit longer to go over some of these last points with me. But this idea around this life isn't like a box of chocolates. It's actually more like a 7-layer triangle cake turned on its side with a cherry on top, which looks more like this, is something that I would hope that you would think about for a little while and see if it's useful in your life and your business and how you kind of approach no code, low code development or art or whatever it is that you do or would like to do. And I hope that it's useful. It's useful for me. It's how I kind of interact with the world and think about my place in it and what I have to offer and how I might be able to utilize what I observe to create interesting things. Um, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I will give you my information in just a moment. But I hope, as I said, that was, spark something about, that to make you think about something in your life that would allow you to be more creative, to have some different inspiration. And then as far as announcements go, as we transition into this last part of this section, this is the Wednesday build, and there's a new episode live every Wednesday. I'll go over next week's topic in a moment. I have new issues out every Tuesday of Code Word Hex, which is the free digital interactive magazine that I created using Documate. I have plenty of courses and more to come on things like software and Airtable, Documate, which I have certifications courses for in Chromium Academy. Also, I'm running the fellowship right now for the Law Students in Legal Tech Access to Justice Fellowship. We just started a week ago, and today we just had our second live session, which is going really well, and people are doing really great in this course or in this fellowship. So I'm really excited to see what they build. Also, feel free to join the Chromium community, which is called Chromium Global. And the Documate community is really active on Slack, so I do highly recommend that you join them as well. So thank you so much for your time. We're going to be meeting again next Wednesday, the 1st of February at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So we're going to be talking about filling up your reservoir, why Bird by Bird author Anne Lamott says there's no such thing. She says there's no such thing as writer's block, but we're going to use here no such thing as builder's block. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect with new people and to learn about other people's experiences. You can also connect with me via email at brittany@chromium.pro. For inquiries regarding Documate's law school program, please email me at brittany@documate.org, just so that I can keep all of that organized. And thank you again so much for being here. I appreciate your time and attention, and I hope that was useful, and I'll see you in next week's episode. Bye, everyone.